On my first day walking the floor of my new company, dressed in an old cardigan instead of a suit, a young manager stopped in front of me in the break room, looked me up and down like I'd wandered in off the street, and shouted, loud enough for the entire floor to hear, "Who let this old man in here? This is a private office, sir, you need to leave right now." 20 people turned to stare. Some of them laughed. I didn't say a word. I just waited, quietly, for the meeting that was already scheduled to start in exactly 11 minutes, the one where I would be introduced to the entire company as their new chief executive officer. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories about the assumptions people make and the moments those assumptions collapse in front of everyone watching. My name is Walter Higgins, and this is the story of my first day at a company that judged me completely wrong, and what happened once they found out exactly who they were dealing with. I spent 34 years building a career in operations and turnaround management, the kind of work that rarely makes headlines but that quietly determines whether a struggling company survives or collapses. I started as a floor supervisor at a manufacturing plant in my 20s, worked my way through logistics, supply chain, and eventually executive leadership roles at 3 different companies, each one larger and more complicated than the last. By the time I turned 62, I had led 2 major corporate turnarounds that industry publications had actually written about, and I had, frankly, reached a point in my career where I could have comfortably retired and spent my remaining working years consulting from home in far more relaxed conditions than what I actually chose to do next. I took the position at Halstead Meridian, a mid-sized technology services company based downtown, because the board had reached out to me directly, describing a business that had strong underlying fundamentals but had drifted, over the previous several years, into a stagnant, complacent culture that was quietly costing them market share to more agile competitors. The previous CEO had been let go after 2 years of missed growth targets, and the board wanted someone who could walk in, assess the actual culture on the ground, not just the numbers on a spreadsheet, and make hard, necessary changes before the company's position eroded any further. I want to explain something about my approach to new leadership roles, because it matters directly to what happened on that first day. Over 3 decades of doing this kind of work, I developed a specific philosophy that I've never once regretted, even when it created exactly the kind of uncomfortable situation I'm about to describe. Before I ever walk into a new company as its announced leader, I spend at least 1 full day observing that company as an ordinary, unrecognized presence, dressed plainly, saying little, simply watching how people actually behave when they don't believe anyone important is watching them. I've found, across 3 decades and multiple companies, that this single day tells me more honest, unfiltered truth about an organization's actual culture than months of formal meetings, presentations, and carefully rehearsed introductions ever could. People behave very differently toward someone they believe holds no power over them than they do toward an announced authority figure, and that difference, that gap between performed professionalism and genuine daily behavior, is often exactly where a company's real problems are hiding. So on my first official day at Halstead Meridian, rather than walking in wearing an executive suit with an assistant trailing behind me, I arrived nearly 2 hours before my formal introduction meeting was scheduled, dressed in a simple gray cardigan, plain slacks, and a pair of comfortable walking shoes, looking, I fully understood and intended, like an older man who might have wandered in for any number of unremarkable reasons: a building inspector, a retired employee stopping by, a visitor's elderly father waiting for someone. I signed in at the front desk using a visitor badge that simply said consultant, a small, deliberate ambiguity that the head of HR, the only person who knew my actual identity and plan for that morning, had arranged in advance at my request. I spent the first hour and a half simply walking the floors, observing meetings through glass conference room walls, noting the general energy and pace of the office, and eventually made my way to the 4th floor break room around 9:30, intending to get a cup of coffee and continue quietly observing the flow of the office before my 10 o'clock introduction. The break room was moderately busy that morning, several employees getting coffee, a couple of small conversations happening near the refrigerator, the ordinary low hum of an office starting its day. I poured myself a cup of coffee, added a small amount of cream, and was standing near the counter, simply observing the room, when a woman I would later learn was named Brittany Cole, a mid-level marketing manager who had been with the company for about 4 years, walked in, stopped short when she saw me, and looked me over with an expression of open, immediate suspicion. I want to describe exactly what happened next, because the details matter to understanding both what went wrong and what it revealed. Brittany set down the folder she was carrying, crossed her arms, and asked, in a tone that was less a question than an accusation, what I was doing in the break room. I told her, calmly, that I was simply getting a cup of coffee, which was, of course, entirely true. She asked who I was there to see, and I told her, honestly if incompletely, that I had a meeting scheduled shortly and was simply waiting. This answer, for reasons I still find somewhat baffling in retrospect, seemed to escalate rather than resolve her suspicion. She said something about how the building had security protocols and that visitors weren't supposed to be wandering the floors unaccompanied, her voice rising slightly with each sentence. I told her, still calmly, that I understood, and that I'd be happy to wait wherever she felt was most appropriate. Instead of directing me somewhere, she turned toward the small cluster of employees near the refrigerator, several of whom had already started watching this exchange with the particular, uncomfortable attention people give to a scene they can sense is about to escalate, and said, loudly enough that her voice carried across the entire break room and likely into the hallway beyond it, who let this old man in here? This is a private office, sir, you need to leave right now, this isn't a public building. I remember the room going quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone present recognizes something has crossed from ordinary interaction into genuine spectacle. A few people laughed, not maliciously exactly, but with the easy, reflexive laughter people give to a moment of unexpected drama, the kind of laugh that comes before anyone's had time to think about whether laughing is actually appropriate. One younger employee, standing near the coffee machine, actually said, loud enough for me to hear clearly, "Yeah, sir, this is probably not the place for you," in a tone that managed to be both dismissive and mildly amused at the same time. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because I think the emotional reality matters more than simply describing the facts of what happened. I have been in leadership roles for over 3 decades, and very rarely, at this stage of my career, does anyone speak to me the way Brittany Cole spoke to me in that break room. There was a flash of something, not quite anger, closer to a kind of tired, familiar recognition, the specific feeling of being reduced, instantly and completely, to a single visible characteristic, my age, my plain clothing, without a single question asked about who I actually was or why I was there. I could have identified myself in that moment. I want to be clear that I made a deliberate choice not to, because I understood, even in the middle of that uncomfortable scene, that this exact moment was providing me with information I could never have gotten any other way. I said, simply and calmly, that I was sorry for the confusion, and I stepped back from the counter, coffee still in hand, and made my way toward the elevator, aware of several sets of eyes following me as I left, some curious, a few still faintly amused. I checked my watch as I stepped into the elevator. It was 9:42. My formal introduction to the entire company, scheduled in the largest conference room on the 6th floor, was set for 10 o'clock exactly. I spent the remaining 18 minutes in a small office the outgoing CEO's assistant had prepared for me, changing quickly into the suit I'd brought in a garment bag specifically for this purpose, reviewing my notes for the introduction, and, I'll admit, thinking a great deal about what had just happened in that break room, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of clear, focused attention, the same attention I bring to any piece of information that tells me something important about an organization's actual, lived culture. At 10 o'clock, I walked into that 6th floor conference room, now in a suit rather than a cardigan, and was formally introduced by the board chairman to the assembled leadership team and department heads. Nearly 60 people gathered in person and dozens more joining remotely, as Halstead Meridian's new chief executive officer. I want to describe Brittany Cole's face in that room, because I will genuinely never forget it as long as I live. She was seated toward the middle of the room, having been invited as part of the marketing leadership team, and I watched, in real time, the exact moment recognition crossed her features, watched the color actually drain from her face as she realized, with what must have been genuinely dizzying speed, that the old man she'd shouted out of the break room less than 20 minutes earlier was the same person the board chairman was now introducing as the person who would be signing off on her department's budget, her performance reviews, and quite possibly her continued employment. I gave my introductory remarks that morning as I would have given them regardless of what had happened in that break room, focused primarily on the company's actual business challenges, the cultural assessment I intended to conduct over my first 90 days, and my general philosophy about operating with both high standards and genuine respect throughout every level of the organization. I did not, in that meeting, mention the break room incident at all, though I noticed, throughout my remarks, that Brittany sat rigidly still, visibly holding her composure, clearly bracing for a public reckoning that I had no intention of delivering in front of 50 of her colleagues. I asked Brittany to meet with me privately later that same afternoon, a request that I'm certain, based on her expression when my assistant delivered the message, filled her with a level of dread I could genuinely sympathize with, even as I believed the conversation needed to happen. When she arrived at my office, she looked, understandably, like someone bracing for the worst possible outcome of her professional career. I want to walk through that conversation carefully, because I think how I handled it matters as much to this story as the break room incident itself. I told Brittany, honestly and without theatrics, that I understood exactly why the morning's incident had happened. I explained my deliberate practice of observing companies incognito before formal introductions, and I told her clearly that I did not consider her actions, in isolation, to be some kind of unforgivable offense worthy of immediate termination, which I could see, from her visible relief, was genuinely not the outcome she had expected walking into that office. But I also told her, directly and without softening it unnecessarily, exactly what her behavior in that break room had revealed to me, not about her specifically as an individual, but about a pattern I have unfortunately witnessed at multiple companies over my career. A pattern where certain employees extend automatic respect and careful professionalism toward anyone who visibly signals power or importance, while treating anyone who doesn't immediately read as significant, an older person in plain clothes, a maintenance worker, a new hire who doesn't yet carry visible authority, with a dismissiveness or even outright hostility that reveals something genuinely important and uncomfortable about a person's actual character, as opposed to their performed professional character. I asked Brittany directly whether she would have spoken to a man in an expensive suit the way she'd spoken to me in that cardigan, and I watched her sit with that question for a long, uncomfortable moment before answering, honestly, that she probably wouldn't have. I told her that this honesty, painful as it clearly was for her to offer in that moment, was actually the most important thing she could bring to the rest of our conversation, because real growth, in my experience over 3 decades of leading organizations, never starts from defensiveness. It starts from exactly that kind of uncomfortable, honest self-recognition. I told her that I wasn't going to terminate her employment over a single incident, however embarrassing it had been for both of us, but that I did expect, going forward, a demonstrated, genuine shift in how she treated everyone she encountered in that building, not just the people who visibly signaled power or authority. I told her I would be watching, not out of some punitive surveillance, but because culture change in any organization starts with leadership actually noticing the small, everyday moments that most people assume nobody important is paying attention to, which was, after all, exactly the entire premise of why I'd walked those floors in a cardigan that morning in the first place. Brittany's response to that conversation, in the months that followed, genuinely surprised me, in a good way. She could have simply performed contrition for a few weeks and then reverted to old patterns once she assumed the immediate danger had passed, something I have absolutely seen happen with other employees at other companies following similarly uncomfortable wake-up calls. Instead, she seemed to actually sit with the discomfort of that conversation in a way that produced real, sustained change. Colleagues mentioned to me, unprompted, over the following months, that Brittany had become noticeably more patient and respectful with support staff, with new hires, with anyone lower in the organizational hierarchy than herself, a shift that several people described as genuinely surprising given her reputation before that incident. About 6 months into my tenure as CEO, during a routine walk through the building, I happened to witness Brittany handling a genuinely difficult interaction with an older maintenance worker who had accidentally interrupted one of her meetings while addressing an urgent building issue. Rather than the kind of dismissive impatience I might have expected from her a year earlier, I watched her pause the meeting, thank the maintenance worker warmly for flagging the issue promptly, and follow up with him personally after the meeting ended to make sure the problem had actually been resolved. I don't think that moment was performed for my benefit, since she had no idea I was observing from down the hallway. I think it was simply evidence of a genuine, internalized shift in how she'd come to understand respect and professional conduct, one that had started, uncomfortably but ultimately productively, in a break room on my very first day. I've thought a great deal, over the 18 months since that first day, about what that break room incident actually revealed, not just about Brittany Cole specifically, but about organizational culture more broadly. I've led 4 major companies over the course of my career, and in every single one, I've found that the way employees treat people who appear to hold no power over them tells you more honest truth about an organization's actual values than any mission statement framed in the lobby ever could. Companies love to put words like respect and integrity on their walls. Far fewer companies actually build cultures where those words hold true in the unwatched, unglamorous moments, the break room encounters, the interactions with support staff, the treatment of anyone who doesn't immediately signal status or authority. I never fired Brittany Cole. In fact, she received a promotion just under a year after that first day, based on genuinely strong performance and, I believe, a real and lasting shift in how she approached her colleagues and her own assumptions about who deserved basic respect. I mention this not because I think every story like this needs a redemption arc to be meaningful, but because I genuinely believe the point of that entire morning was never about punishing one young manager for a single embarrassing mistake. The point was using an uncomfortable, honest moment as a mirror, one that showed an entire organization, starting with its newest leader, exactly what needed to change, and giving the people involved a real, genuine chance to actually change it. I still walk company floors incognito, whenever I take on a new leadership role, even now, well into my 60s, even knowing that I might, once again, end up standing quietly in some break room while someone assumes I'm nothing more than a confused old man who wandered somewhere he doesn't belong. I've learned, across 3 decades of doing this, that those uncomfortable moments are never actually about me. They're about the truth an organization reveals about itself in the seconds before it realizes anyone important is watching, and that truth, however embarrassing it might be for the people involved when it finally surfaces, is almost always exactly the information a real leader needs most. If you've ever been completely underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were actually talking to, I want to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, make sure you subscribe to Betrayal Stories so you never miss the next one. We've got a lot more coming, and some of these stories reveal truths even bigger than this one did. See you in the next video.